My very best friend in the world, Sammy Sawchuk, he told me that it was Kelly Upson and Phil Giles. But Phil Giles, his best friend, Kevin Letman, told me that that just wasn't true. He said it was Terry Stewart and Jen Pinney. But Terry Stewart's very best friend in the world, Stephen Coe, said that Terry Stewart didn't even, like Jen Pinney. He told me that it was Tony Anderson and Debbie Jones. But Tony Anderson, he wasn't even on the canoe trip. In the end, none of us really knew who was involved. All we did know for sure is that some couple were doing some things underneath the overturned canoes down by the shore every night after 10 p.m. curfew. We were in grade 9 that summer, earning a high school credit the fun way in a 4-week outdoor education course. There were 16 of us in the group, 8 guys, 8 girls, plus our 2 teachers, Mr. Wapple and Ms. David. And we were into the grand finale of the entire course, a 7-night wilderness canoe trip. Now, as you can well imagine, bringing together, 16 adolescents posed a full-time challenge by way of supervision for our 2 teachers. Wilderness canoe trips necessitate the most intimate of sleeping quarters. So Mr. Wapple and Miss David established strict canoe trip protocols. Each night when we arrived at our new destination, the 4 boys' tents were pitched campsite right. The 4 girls' tents pitched campsite left. The space in between the tents was declared common ground during daylight hours, but strictly no man's land after dark. Mr. Wapple pitched his tent on the right, commandant of the boys' camp, and kept an eye on us from there, while Ms. David guarded her girls from the tent on the right. Curfew was established as precisely 10 p.m. sharp, and any camper caught out after curfew, we were warned, was in very, very big trouble. Now, I won't presume to speak for the ladies on that particular trip. Back in grade 9, I considered girls a strange, exotic, and, ultimately incomprehensible species. But as for us guys, by and large, we obeyed our teachers. Mr. Wapple, simply because Mr. Wapple overwhelmed us. Mr. Wapple was tall, muscular, supremely self-confident. Every adolescent boy's sort of aspirational dream. And as for Ms. David, Ms. David embodied those other aspirational dreams of a lot of SLI boys. So, we obeyed Mr. Wapple out of fear and Ms. David out of, likely very faint hope. But 2 of our gang were clearly willing to disobey. Because every night, if you listened carefully, and the breeze was just right, you could hear whisperings, soft endearments, fumblings, drifting up from those overturned canoes down by the shore. An upside-down canoe, it turns out, acts like an amplifier. And the amorous activities of 2 of our gang, whoever they were being clearly broadcast through the northern night skies. Now, the precise nature of what might have been happening under those canoes was actually more than a bit of a mystery to most of us. We boys, of course, in public, boasted of vast resumes in all sub-canoe proceedings. But the truth of the matter is we were a fairly sweetly sheltered group of kids. We attended a small private school, and, we grew up in that last of the innocent ages, before the internet. And really, much more important to most of us in the gang than any of the mechanics of what was happening underneath the canoe was that burning adolescent question of precisely who in our gang it was happening to. My best friend for life, tent mate and paddling partner Sammy Sawchuk, we spent every free moment in that entire 7-day canoe trip speculating on that particular question. Who was under the canoe? Was it Debbie Jones and Phil Giles? Was it Terry Stewart and Kelly Upson? Finally, halfway down the lake in day 4 of the trip, Sammy put down his paddle in the bow and turned to me in the stern. Jeff, he said, instead of just talking about it all the time, why don't we just wait till tonight, Jeff, and we can just go down there after curfew and look? Well, I immediately vetoed that plan. Sammy, I explained, exasperated that all my life I had to explain this sort of thing to other people. Sammy, you just can't go through life improvising, Sammy. You need structure, you need organization. Sammy, you need a plan. Now, Sammy had been my friend a long time, so he simply sighed and said, okay, Jeff, you do your planning thing that you do, but hurry up, we're running out of nights on the trip. So I got to work on formulating a plan. And by the next day at noon, well, I was ready. My plan required the services of a third man. Sammy vouched for Phil Giles. And that afternoon, on a portage, I brought my team together. Gentlemen, I give you Operation Flashlight. Now, you're good men, you deserve the truth, so I won't lie to you, gentlemen. Operation Flashlight is a dangerous, dangerous mission. If we are caught, gentlemen, the consequences will be severe. We will lose our outdoor education credit for sure, and they might phone our parents. So back away now if you have any reservations. Well, Sammy and Phil looked to each other. They knew the risks. Nobody wanted that phone call home. But the chance to shine a flashlight on the couple underneath the canoe, well, that was just too good to miss. We're in, they said. And Operation Flashlight was a go. And then, well, it rained really hard that afternoon, and us three guys decided to just stay in our tent and eat s'mores. So it came down to a final night. But in the final night, the weather was perfect. All day long, we waited till 10 p.m. curfew, then nodded to each other as we retired to our tents. 10 p.m. Mr. Wapple announced curfew. Campers retired to their tents. 10:15 p.m. The only sound, Mr. Wapple's footsteps patrolling the perimeter. 10:25 p.m. Mr. Wapple returns to his tent for the night. 10:40 p.m. The light in Mr. Wapple's tent goes out. Silence on the campground. Crickets. Out on the lake, a solitary loon. 10:50. Soft footsteps. A twig snaps underfoot. 10:55. Whisperings. Gentle endearments. Soft fumblings. Drifting up from those overturned canoes down by the shore. I looked to Sammy and nodded once. Sammy used his flashlight to beam Phil's tent. Phil beamed back twice. It was go time. On our bellies, we crawled commando style out of the tents, inching our way down towards the canoes by the shore. From out of our peripheral vision, Sammy pointed to Phil, taking up a flanking position on our extreme right. We moved in closer and closer, then stopped, listening, breathless, triangulating in on the sound of the amorous couple. Phil pointed to a solitary red canoe set apart from the others. He nodded. Sammy and I nodded back. Target acquired. We moved in quiet and close, inching our way towards the canoe. Phil took up a position at the canoe's stern, waiting. Sammy took up a position at the bow. I waited between the two of them, my finger itchy on the on button of the flashlight. We started our silent countdown. 1, I motioned. Sammy and Phil grabbed their ends of the canoe. 2, I motioned. Sammy and Phil prepared to spring. And on 3, we sprung our trap. Sammy and Phil leapt up high, holding the canoe above their head. And I beamed bright light on the couple underneath. And then, I froze, horrified, dropped my flashlight, and sprinted for the safety of my tent. And Sammy and Phil, sensing that something had gone terribly, horribly wrong with the plan, Sammy and Phil dropped the canoe. A howl of rage and pain pierced the night sky. And then, just as suddenly, silence. Ominous. Inexplicable. Silence. Out in the lake, a loon called. Crickets. But nothing else. It was as if nothing had happened at all. Back in the tent, Sammy turned to me. So, Jeff, who did you see? Who it was? And Jeff, why did you run? And I lied. I lied to my very best friend for life, Sammy Sawchuk. Sammy, I didn't see who it was, Sammy. They had their backs to me, and the glare of the flashlight, Sammy, and then I sort of panicked. Sammy, I guess we'll never really know. Oh well, it was a lot of fun and we didn't get caught. And then Sammy, sweet, innocent, live in the moment Sammy, he just rolled over and fell back asleep. But I didn't sleep. I knew that my life was ruined. I had just lost my outdoor education credit for sure, and there was going to be a phone call home to my parents. It hadn't been Kelly Upson. It hadn't been Debbie Jones. It hadn't been Brad Scrivens. It hadn't been Terry Stewart. You know who it was. Mr. Wapple with Ms. David. All the next day, I waited for the axe to fall. I was firmly convinced that my two teachers would call me to account, probably in front of the entire assembled camp, for what was clearly my flagrant violation of the curfew regulations. But strangely, inexplicably, my two teachers were acting as though, well, nothing at all had even happened the night before. In fact, if it weren't for the, well, sizable bruise on Mr. Wapple's forehead, I might have imagined the entire thing. Well, I thought, if they're not going to publicly call me out, then maybe they'll just quietly fail me when they hand out report cards this afternoon. But when Mr. Wapple handed me my report card, I had passed with a mark way higher than I knew I deserved. Still, I didn't really exhale until that evening when my father drove into the parking lot to take me home from outdoor education camp. I was there waiting at the parking lot, backpack and paddle and everything ready, eager to effect a quick and hasty retreat from that place. But no such luck. Mr. Wapple and Ms. David were in the parking lot too, seeing off the campers and glad-handing the parents. Come on, Dad, I said. I've got my report card. We don't have to do that teacher stuff. We can go right home now. But my father, maddeningly, was already out of the car and, well, waiting for his opportunity to say hello with my teachers. And then Mr. Wapple saw us. And I realized I was going to have to introduce Mr. Wapple to my dad. Mr. Wapple strode over. Dad, this is Mr. Wapple, my outdoor education teacher. Mr. Wapple extended a hearty handshake to my father. Your son Jeffrey is a promising student, and I have to say he certainly knows his way around a canoe. And then Mr. Wapple turned a broad wink in my direction and continued with my dad. And I hope in my own small way I've helped to further your son's appreciation of the possibilities inherent in that magnificent craft. And then he was gone and off to greet more parents. Mr. Wapple seems like a likable enough chap, my dad commented as he was driving me home. And it sounds, Jeff, as though he showed you some really interesting things about canoes this summer. I guess you could say that, Dad. Some of what Mr. Walpole showed me was really interesting.